Yeah, so our project is called Co-Learning Approaches to Talking and Thinking About Pee, Community Perspectives on Urine Recycling, Communication, and Education. And this stemmed from an Infuse project that was called Advancing Technologies for Improving Communication of Urine-Derived Fertilizers for Food Production within a risk-based framework. And that project started in 2016, and it's over now, but we're still working on what we've learned from it, and we're still kind of extending the thinking about it to the work that Julia and I work at Rich Earth Institute, and to the work that we do at that organization. So the project involved a technical team that was focused on looking at pharmaceuticals in urine and their levels in plants grown with urine, because that's one of the biggest concerns that we have when thinking about using human urine as a fertilizer. Our stakeholders often raise that question about the potential contamination from potential pharmaceuticals in urine. So the technical team was looking at that. And then there was a social research team that was focused on communication and education strategies. And that's kind of why I asked that question, because in this project, one of the questions that came up for me was how the social team and the technical team relate to each other. Well, we can talk more about that later. But the three of us presenting today are part of the social research team. And so through ecological sanitation, which this graphic illustrates, a linear system for what happens with our waste becomes a circular system, so that what we call waste from our bodies can be reclaimed to sustain communities in terms of fertilizer and food production. But this type of transformation requires obviously both physical changes in our whole infrastructure, waste management system, and sociocultural changes in how we talk and think and act. So what we're talking about here is thinking about the challenges in education and communication about this topic. And some of the kinds of stakeholders that we worked with for this project include members of the general public, which is anybody who has toilets in their homes or anybody who eats food, so just everybody. So we had sort of focus groups with members of the general public. And then we did a lot of interviews with all the other potential stakeholders. So that could be planners, legislators, builders, farmers, people in the agriculture industry, in the agribusiness industry, like fertilizer industry people, as many different kinds of people as we could think of. And we started out with certain assumptions about what people's interest in this or anxieties about this might be, and we needed to find out if we were right. And some of our assumptions really turned out not to be correct. For example, we assumed that people would have a taboo or a sense of disgust about the use of human urine as a fertilizer. And we really haven't found that so much. People often ascribe that belief to other people when we ask them about it, but that they themselves say that they would feel relatively comfortable with using urine-based fertilizer. So that was one of the interesting things that we found out. But Shayna will talk about some of the other lessons that we've learned.
Yeah, so kind of our biggest lesson so far has really been around trust and building trust in relationships with these different kinds of stakeholders. And this has kind of also been highlighted by some of the larger challenges with scientific communication around the COVID-19 pandemic. And so some issues with trust have emerged as really important in our research, mainly from this distrust in knowledge that's more externally produced, and also not having opportunities for more critical conversations about how that research was conducted and not any opportunities for collaborative research. And so we've really come to realize the importance of providing opportunities for dialogue in many kinds of contexts. And in the photos here, you can see some of the contexts that we've explored so far. At the top, at the University of Michigan, some of the researchers here worked together to develop a learning case that is kind of a hypothetical situation based on a real implementation of urine diverting toilets in one of the buildings on campus. And so there was this case study that was trying to get people to think about what that implementation and decision-making process would be, who would be affected, all of those different concerns. And so there was a fishbowl activity that we piloted in the classroom where students kind of took on the perspective of different people that would be involved and kind of simulated the decision-making process around implementing these urine diversion toilets in school buildings, like in their own community. And then in the bottom picture, this is in Vermont with an on-farm demonstration of one of the kind of trial sites for a hemp farmer. And so here there's people coming who are kind of learning about these urine-derived fertilizers, where they're being used, and they can see it being used, and that can spark those conversations there. So those are some of the very specific contexts. And that's been really important for us to develop these relationships based on these different contexts and built on trust and real collaboration, where our work is always kind of moving forward based on what different community members' curiosities and concerns are. And so we've found that some key parts of this is not just making knowledge about the science of the urine diversion, the technology, and even the economic factors publicly accessible, but also engaging people in the process of the development of that knowledge. And so not just being really transparent about what we know at the moment and what we don't know at the moment, but also inviting more and more questions and these really critical conversations about perspectives beyond our own. So that way the community knowledge and the control are prioritized from the outset. And so this kind of co-learning approach envisions scientists and practitioners as partners in communication, education, and implementation to transform this human waste into a valued resource. And so really eliciting these different community perspectives through some of these kind of experiential learning processes. So the tools that we're using in the classroom, different educational workshops, and also on-farm demonstrations and engagement can enable more collaboration in developing and piloting new technologies, and initiating more and more infrastructure change and identifying future pathways to adoption, including co-creating recommendations for best practices for use of these fertilizers, educational resources, regulatory decision-making, and different planning processes.
Sorry, muted. So building off of that, I think one of our biggest challenges, as Tatiana was mentioning earlier, kind of talking about the issue of pharmaceuticals in urine is a good way to illustrate this, I think. But just kind of the general challenge of finding that balance between communicating about the known risk and how we believe that we know that risk, and creating the space for talking about the scientific uncertainty and also the kind of distrust that exists between communities and externally produced scientific knowledge about this. And so specifically, with urine, one of the biggest concerns that people have is about the pharmaceuticals that are in urine. And so we think about this in the context of conventional linear sanitation systems where those pharmaceuticals are often mostly not removed from wastewater streams and released into downstream water bodies where they disrupt aquatic species and can get into people's drinking water and have all kinds of known and unknown effects on aquatic ecologies and human health from being in drinking water. And so we kind of communicate about the risk of pharmaceuticals in urine within that context. And the technical team did research looking at the fate of pharmaceuticals in urine when applied as a fertilizer in the crop tissue. And what they found was that it's present in incredibly tiny amounts in the nanogram per billion range. So very, 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 very tiny, but still there. And so it's kind of communicating this small amount to people so that you know that it's there, but then how do you make decisions based on that small amount in the context of living in a contaminated world where, you know, everyone has PFAS and there's, you know, contamination in a lot of the food that we eat and drink, including that downstream drinking water. And so beyond communication, we feel that it's important to find ways to develop community-based approaches to understanding how to make these decisions about what levels of risk we're willing to accept and where, and understanding what these tiny amounts mean in terms of risk for different things. And then thinking about what additional, for example, like treatment steps would you want to add to try to remove pharmaceuticals in urine, or what other options would you want to consider? But in addition to thinking about these kind of like known risks, stakeholders also had a lot of questions about the kind of more uncertain risks fueled by distrust in government and sources of funding and histories of environmental racism, and kind of the larger sort of societal implications of this system change as well, in addition to the contamination questions. So yeah, we're curious to hear what other researchers have done to address similar issues in terms of these questions. And yeah, would love to hear your thoughts on this. Thanks.